So much. Daniel, you can all hear me all right?
We can.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you very much. So great, as always, to see all of you. I'm so thankful that you're here. Sarah, it's nice to see you here. Scott, wonderful book. Your last one, was it with Oxford? Was Yeah, it's a great book. Ted, it's nice to see you all here, Mark, everybody. I wanted to begin actually by thanking Clyde Christopher, who's not here, I don't think, but maybe he'll show up, for supporting my work through my Psychoanalytic Ramblings Patreon account. It's very much appreciated. Thank you, Clyde. Okay, so how should I begin? You know, I thought about ending the lecture series prematurely last week. I just wanted it to end, you know, but the sessions continue and they go on and on. It reminds me of an expression I first heard. It maybe Lacan said it, but I first heard it through Jacques-Alain Miller, from his seminar, I think, on the One All Alone. The etc. of the symptom. I think it was there that I really learned about Lacan's equivalence of the unconscious and the symptom, making them into an ellipsis, and etc. Or if you like, and so on and so on and so on. At the level of the and so on, we can say that psychoanalysis persists, I think. The sessions can go on and on, which it even, it compels me to ask if teaching is a symptom. A friend who's here said to me recently that when I'm teaching, it's as if I have access to these signifiers that are circulating in the real. That's how he put it. I liked it. Thank you, Mark. Anyway, if the sessions continue in that way, I think it's because there's something that continues to sever. It continues to sever. And it continues to sever itself from the signifier and its field of meaning, and so on, and so on. I call that the separation that doesn't make a separation, otherwise referred to as foreclosure. It's the separation that doesn't make a separation. And it even leads me to wonder if, when you're speeding along the highway of foreclosure, you're nonetheless forced every so often to hit a speed bump, which means that maybe there's still a hope that things can slow down a little bit for us. Anyway, you'll have to endure a bit more rambling today, because in spite of it all, it perseveres. This perseverance, I don't think it leads me to turn to my brothers or my brother, as it did maybe for Antigone with Polynesius, or even as it did maybe for Schreber in his early years when he turned to his brothers in the fraternity, college fraternity. When Antigone, I'm not a close reader of Antigone, so forgive me if I get some things wrong, but when Antigone was really in the shit, when she was confronting Creon's consternation, when the moment when Creon's definitely beginning to crumble, he's basically trembling in front of her, from what I can gather. And even in Antigone's discussions with, is it Ismene? Wasn't Antigone smiling and laughing? It's the stuff of my nightmares. And it led Ismene to ask Antigone, why are you laughing at me? And then you get this chorus at some point in the play, God hates happiness. God hates happiness. And we're told that God hates the happiness and the joy of war. Joys of war. I was thinking, why does God hate happiness? If I read the play correctly, I'm going from memory right now, so maybe I misread as I did with the Antigone quote last week. Maybe it's because when man is happy, he disappears from being there. And it was why the Creon of the play Antigone was the one for whom God ceased to be an authority. Maybe it's a point I'll return to. I just wanted to say that Antigone was happy, I think. She was happy to have lost her brother because it was through his death that she instituted a phoneg. Which means that through his death, she perpetuated her delusion that she was capable of losing him in the first place. She wasn't capable of losing him. And in the end, she never did lose him. Polyneice's death only perpetuated her proximity to him, intensifying it. I think she probably only covered him in sand to preserve him. Perseverance. Creon's law couldn't separate Antigone from her brother. In the end, he wasn't a signifier to which she and maybe any one of us would have thought worthy of offering ourselves up to. She even said it explicitly. She said, Creon cannot stand in my way. No, she said, Creon is not enough to stand in my way. Not enough. Of what? Here she exemplified a separation that doesn't make a separation. So, did somebody say totalitarianism with regard to Antigone? Did somebody say totalitarianism? Would you believe it if I told you that it was Slavoj Zizek who flirted with this idea of Antigone being a totalitarian? Her so-called totalitarianism? He claimed that she was an exemplary case of toxic masculinity and that she was perhaps proto-totalitarian. I posted the quote, that's what I'm looking at. I posted the quote on my Facebook wall last week. I took it from an interview. It was a point that he arrived at alongside of Alenka Supansik. He claimed, the two of them, he claimed, decided that Antigone was a man and Eichmann was a woman. Eichmann was a woman. I don't think he went far enough here. I don't think Antigone should be understood in the dimension of toxic masculinity, but rather in the dimension of toxic positivity, which I talked about last week. I won't talk about it again. But when she portrayed herself as the betrayal of the law, she was in fact fawning of the law. It was a fawning of the law. It was a resolutely positive rebellion against an impotent law. So it's nonetheless curious that, Zizek referred to Antigone as toxic. He didn't call Creon a totalitarian in this particular quote, in this particular moment when he was discussing Antigone. Okay, so what can we say about Antigone? She was obviously stubborn. She was stubborn. She was incapable of engaging in dialogue or debate. You couldn't reason with her. She frequently chose silence. She refused to lie. I find that interesting. She didn't lie. She always told the truth without hiding it, which means there's no repression of the truth in the sense that came through slips or whatever, right? But is it enough for us to claim that she was fascist? I don't think so. But I think there's something that's nonetheless worth exploring. I want to take a short detour. so I can make maybe a few remarks about Antigone's real love, her real love. When I say real love, I'm not referring to her love for her brother, you know, her unshakable, intense love for her brother. I'm talking about Haman's love for Antigone. Haman had a deep love for Antigone. I'd like to see a book written on revolutionary politics about Haman, by the way. Haman, is that how you say his name? You know, forget about Antigone. What's Haman's politics? That would be a theme worth exploring. Haman is, I think, at the center of the Sophoclean tragedy, yet he's not in the title. He's hardly mentioned by commentators, hardly in the play itself, really. Specifically, hardly mentioned by political commentators. Antigone is the title of the play. The title of the play could have been an ellipses. Maybe it could have been called God, ... or worse. We might be tempted to claim that Antigone was basically innocent because she refused to engage in any direct aggression. So she's basically innocent. She didn't engage in any direct aggression. Maybe it's true, but didn't her actions nonetheless lead several people in the play to commit suicide? That's not nothing. Several major characters, including Haman, Haman's mother, and so on. So how could we ignore this silent cruelty on the part of Antigone? It's a silent cruelty. Are we to presume that their suicides are insignificant because maybe they're a part of the ruling establishment? Maybe they're, you know, Ward Churchill had this expression. He got into a lot of trouble for it many years ago. Were they little Eichmanns? You know? So are we to presume that silence always brings us some holy thing? It's great. Silence always brings us closer to God, as some of the Jesuits under, I'm looking at Mark right now, under St. Ignatius seem to believe. Haman loved Antigone deeply. He was prepared to die in defense of her. And that's what he did. In that sense, he's just as stubborn as his father, Creon, because he was defending the indefensible. Haman was set on killing Creon, but he turned the sword, pressing it upon himself, I think. Maybe, you know, it even makes me think, maybe Haman's, you know, like there's this hip expression in New York City. I'm not sure how much it's expanded out to the rest of the world, but maybe Haman's what they call in New York a simp. You know this expression, simp, S-I-M-P? Maybe he was a bit like a simp. Haman the simp. Haman would have made, by the way, I think Haman, it would have been a good title for the play, Haman, instead of Antigone. If he demonstrated that he was worthy of the title, of the name. On the one side for Antigone, there's this tyrannical king of Thebes, Creon, king. On the other side, there's the pathetic simp. Like, what kind of choice is that? It's not a choice. In both cases, it doesn't matter, for at least for Antigone, because both are signifiers that are rejected. The simp circumambulates around Antigone, an extension of her world, maybe her theory of the world in some sense, never accepted except in that dimension. The tyrannical signifier, Creon, attempts to press the law into Antigone's soul, yet he's only ever witnessed from a distance, the distance of the tyrant out there that he was. Is there any signifier in the play that would have been acceptable for Antigone to offer herself up basically, I think they're morons. I think they're three morons. Antigone, Creon, and Haman are morons. They're three morons who, in each their own way, refuse to be stupid enough to allow for some idiocy. They were reduced to the function of non-dupery. So we can't say that they were idiots, but I don't think that they demonstrated a lack of idiotology. Maybe it was para-ideology. But anyway, I'm going to go a bit further because I really want to try and provoke you today. I'm going to provoke you. What's to stop us from provisionally claiming that today's ultimate geopolitical figure of Antigone is Russia? It's actually a topic I've been rambling about for a couple of years before the events unfolded in Ukraine. And I can't develop it all today, but I'll discuss maybe a bit of it. Okay, first, we should be honest. Okay, we're really in the shit today. Like, seriously. In addition to military escalation, there's an inflation or economic crisis. There's an environmental crisis. I'm in Ireland, there's a housing crisis. There's a health, biological crisis, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. That's what it means to be devoured by Mother Nature, I think. One crisis at a time, and yet in some sense, they're all related to, I don't know, some of us call it capitalism. And, you know, I feel like I have to be delicate when I talk about this stuff, but I should mention that I'm not unaffected by it. Although I've been fairly silent about that fact for the last 2 weeks, I'm not unaffected by all of this. I lost everything, right? I lost my family, my home, my career, everything. But I'm finding a way to live with this, and so on, and so on, and so on. I speak about it in one way or another. So I think what I would say is I'm speaking from experience, not from theory. I'm speaking from experience. It doesn't make it any easier, by the way. It makes it more difficult, but I persist. And I risk the provocation that Russia is maybe the Antigonian figure today. I just want to leave it hanging for a minute because I think I need to develop an adjacent point regarding Creon. Since, you know, one of you asked a question or raised a question, Ted, was it? I can't remember, one of you last week, like, what about Creon? We're talking about Antigone. What does that make Creon? Well, I already said it. I think it makes him a moron. But I discovered, of course, I have a very simple reading because I'll just admit it, I just poked around in the play earlier today. I didn't do a deep reading, but I discovered that it seems to me that there's more than one Creonic position. There's the Creon from Oedipus the King, who in some way he recognizes that he's implicated in the catastrophe. In some way, he shares some sense of personal responsibility and so on. He remains fairly reasonable. He's persuadable, and that's precisely what happened. He was persuaded. He makes amends for his mistakes. He's open to dialogue and so on. That doesn't make him perfect, but it's a little bit more different position. And I think it was because he viewed himself as an intermediary between God and the people. But in Oedipus, what is it called? In or at Colonus? Whatever. And in Antigone, didn't we begin to see him transform into something else? Something comes undone. We can't say, or we can say that suddenly he became more stubborn. And at this point, I'm not sure really how to distinguish him so much from the stubbornness of Antigone or the stubbornness of Haman. Creon was intent on maintaining tyrannical rule, insisting upon the cold application of the law. And you can see when he's speaking in the play, how his expressions become more precise, more focused, shorter. He even says, like, I don't remember how he puts it, but like there's too much talking, too much noise. Get to the law. You talk too much is what he said. That's how he put it. You talk too much. He was trying to reduce the noise maybe in order to instigate a signifier of the law uncoupled from meaning. I don't know. So minimally, we could say there are two Creonic positions, minimally. The first was during the accusation against him in Oedipus Rex or whatever. He's being accused and he's remaining calm, and he's kind of in a rational way explaining his position, that he doesn't want to be king for this reason, openly exploring the arguments and the evidence and so on. In the second case, there's a Creon who's transformed into something like an actual father, identifying with the position of the father king, taking total responsibility. There's no God there necessarily. He's administering the law, forming himself into a signifier. And in doing so, he realized, I think, that there was a stubborn one, Antigone, who wouldn't offer herself up to the signifier. So Antigone effectuated a separation from the separation of the signifier. A separation from Creon's law, from the law of the father, which would have, in this, let's say, a second movement, produced a separation of Antigone from her brother, a separation from that separation. And in order for that second separation to occur, she would have had to have offered herself up to Creon's law. So she didn't benefit from the separation. Okay, what about Russia? First, I would say I think it's really important that we read and listen to what Russian officials and state-affiliated intellectuals say or write about themselves. It's important that we do that. It's important to guard against presuppositions, which isn't easy. I would remind you about a statement from Hegel. How did Hegel put it? Maybe I'll return to it again in a moment too. The mysteries of the Egyptians were mysteries to the Egyptians themselves. Is that it? Or secrets of the Egyptians were secrets, I don't know, however you translate. I'm convinced that what we find mysterious about Russia is a mystery to the Russians, to the Kremlin themselves. And it's a feminine position. The mysteries of femininity are mysteries to women themselves. Maybe it's one way, maybe an incorrect way to read that statement, that woman is other to herself. But today things, I think, are much more troubling because we're all living this mystery. We're living the mystery. We've moved from mastery to mystery. And it's why our social bond is so mysterious today. Our social bond has become mysterious. It's even why the biggest secret society in the world today has been insisting for the last 15, 20 years on what? That they are not a secret society, but a society with secrets. They really want to emphasize that point, the Freemasons. They're not a secret society, they're a society with secrets. It's an important distinction. A society with secrets had to take that position, I think, a society with secrets rather than a society that is a secret, because that would only make it consistent with the profane world. So I think it's an important corrective that the Freemasons made in the last few decades. And I think, what's interesting is that there are no secrets today about Freemasonry, for example, just to take one example. It's out there. The secret is out. Whatever you want to know. Whatever it is, you got it. It's out there. But they retain a place for secrecy within the social bond, which isn't unlike the clinic. Marie-Hélène Bruce Thanks, Mark, for helping me remember this earlier. Marie-Ellen Bruce, like 10 minutes before this call, Mark reminded me of this. She wrote this really short piece sometime last year for the Lacanian Reviews online. I'll quote it. "The secret is a rare thing. Places for the secret tend to be ever more scarce. Yet the secret is one of the foundations of the possibility for a peaceful society and coexistence, as well as the possibility to live. Psychoanalysis is one of the rare locations where the secret still has a place." End quote. That doesn't mean it's reducible to the secret society or to the Masonic fraternity or something like that, but it's why I don't think we should begin with presuppositions about Russia. Okay, I'm going to try and develop it though. For example, Vladislav Surkov, whose name maybe you're not familiar with, but he was the former deputy chief of government or some big title like that in Russia. He was one of the closest advisors to Vladimir Putin. He said publicly that Russia operates according to a mysterious, let's call it Janus-faced logic. It doesn't partake in the logic of the nation state. It operates instead according to what some today are calling the civilization state or state civilization. Different model. It's an entirely different logic from the nation state, which doesn't mean that we're without recognizing its influence in the Western world. But it's a stubborn, it's an uncompromising logic that operates without deception. And it's a view that was confirmed just this week, earlier this week, in a piece by Alexander Dugin, a Moscow sociologist who's been a major source of intellectual inspiration for contemporary Kremlin politics. A really short and precise piece for the European Times. He argued that the Russian civilization state is closer to the cultural logic of India, of China, and so on and so on. He described it as a type of civilization that expands and contracts. It expands and it narrows. It's a civilization state expands and it narrows. I think those words are really important. It expands and narrows like a bubble or a balloon. Expands and narrows, bigger or smaller. The social bond can become more inflated, more deflated, depending upon, I don't know, how much wind you let in. And it's a lot of wind. And that's what gives the balloon more surface area, more surface areas, but a lot of wind. There can be dilation or contraction of the social bond. Just like a hole can dilate or contract. A black hole. In physics, a black hole can dilate and contract, like a pupil. Okay, I talked about teaching earlier. Maybe we should also be prepared to admit that pupils dilate and contract. And that's what constitutes teaching for a lot of people today. Expansion and contraction. But all of this, I think, highlights a different logic from the, let's say, international model of solidarity that's hitherto characterized Western nation states, as indicated in the League of Nations, United Nations, so on. Maybe model of European Union, even NATO, why not? So I don't think the problem today is ultimately reducible to a confrontation of NATO and Russia. It's a confrontation between a typewriter and a balloon. And I'm not sure what the difference is. I'm thinking, I hope you can forgive me, I'm really not prepared. But there was this wonderful play. I'm not a Beckett scholar, but there's a wonderful play that I discovered this morning while I was reading a book on Beckett that I got in the mail. I was reading about it. It led me to discover this. It was a play that I think about a balloon that Beckett typed up on his typewriter. It was about the lungs, the breath, and the way they inflate with air and then deflate in a play titled Breath. I'm less of a Beckett scholar than I am a scholar of international relations, or Sophocles, or a scholar of anything, to be honest. So forgive me. But the play seems to involve something of this expansion and contraction of the lungs. And what's striking is that there's no language there in the classical sense of language. What you get in the play is just a scream. Anyway, digressing. Western nations don't see themselves as partaking in the logic of expansion and contraction per se, which doesn't mean that Westerners are not a bunch of airheads, because they are. It seems to me that the Western idea has been to overcome the chasm of the real that separates nations through the implementation of symbolic contracts, peace treaties, trade agreements, and so on. It concerns the efficiency of the symbolic, of the signifier. And of course, it led Immanuel Kant to his perpetual peace, his notion of perpetual peace, placing his trust in the efficiency of the Creonic signifier. But I think, like, didn't the trouble already start to begin in the 1980s? In 1980s America, we can start to see something with Ronald Reagan. A surplus object of the nation state bubbles out. Reagan and other political commentators, politicians, I should say, American politicians, named these, I don't know, bubbles, not surplus, he called them rogue states, the rogue state, or the outlaw state. It gave rise to another expression, the evil empire. And under George W. Bush, you see a similar logic to describe a different cultural geopolitical configuration, the axes of evil. But these bubbles circulated until a new phase or phrase was introduced in the latest decade, maybe a bit more. It's becoming more popular in the field of international relations, the civilization state, or the state civilization. When I first heard the word, it was a couple of years ago. A friend of mine, a sociologist and lawyer from Victoria, Canada, and I spent a couple of days just reading everything I could on the concept. I wouldn't say I understand too much more about it, but I feel like there's something to it. The rogue state classification, you know, when you say rogue state, it's a designation that is resisted by the countries that are described as such. They resist it. They don't want to be known as an outlaw state or a rogue state. But the civilization state is different because it's largely used as a self-declaration. As we saw with Surkov, he said, we are a civilization state. He said it directly. It makes it more autonomous. The West doesn't describe itself in that way. In fact, Donald Trump, not so long ago, tried to return us to the phrase of the rogue state, the outlaw state during his presidential term. I think that makes him a bit nostalgic, stuck in the 1980s maybe. Civilization states are self-designations. You identify with the surplus. You identify with being the waste completely, instead of merely being designated as such in relation to the Western law. So what can we say? I would say that the rogue state is a faux neg of Western civilization. It means that the concept of the civilization state, which is taken up today in India, Russia, China, and so on, it demonstrates precisely that the rogue state was always a faux neg. In the end, civilization is resolutely positive. It's an outlaw, civilization, to the extent that it's a separation that doesn't make a separation from the nation state. So civilization is even more outlaw than the faux neg of the law itself. What the civilization state shows us is that the faux neg, with Russia as our key example, the faux neg of Western civilization, the faux neg of Western civilization inevitably confronts a flooding, from faux neg to flooding. So how does the civilization state function ultimately? It dilates, it contracts, it remains stubborn. It's ultimately indifferent or resistant to symbolic contracts, kind of indifferent to trade agreements and international dialogue and so on. And it remains unafraid of the consequences of this stubborn position. Unlike America, it's already experienced the death, but civilization remains. It makes Russia a lonely figure in the international stage, a monster with a volatile identity, which is precisely what Surkov said it was. Surkov said Russia is lonely. You never hear any representative of a Western nation openly state that their nation is a lonely monster with a volatile identity. You never hear that. Which doesn't mean that they aren't, but they wouldn't say it directly. Like, is Ireland, where I am now, is it a lonely monster? They seem to be on the cusp of recognizing themselves as such, as new screams or old troubles are bubbling out again. They know the troubles never went anywhere. They return to the same place. Anyway, Dugan has also advanced this characterization of the civilization state that I'm presenting, and he's done it over many decades. His critique of what he calls unipolarity, the unipolarity of the geopolitical universe, means that there ought to be a multipolarity. That's what Dugan calls for. You could, in some sense, consider it the strategy of Russia. The aim is for multipolarity. But the first problem with this argument, as I see it, is that multipolarity necessitates the perpetuation of a faux pleur. When we speak of a multipolar world, it means that there's no signifier capable of quilting it together. That's what it means to me. So, Creonic America doesn't do it anymore. It's a serious problem for civilization. So should we take the position of Alexander Dugin or Samuel Huntington? These folks claiming that there's these sort of multiple or a couple irreducible nodes or clusters, cultural clusters that come into conflict with one another, some sort of these singularities in collision with one another. I don't think we should go in that direction. I think that the collapse of unipolarity already occurred, but it doesn't necessitate the conclusion of a multipolar world. There's no reason to move from the collapse of unipolarity toward that of multipolarity. The faux pleur of multipolarity only postpones the traumatic confrontation that's bound to occur, if it hasn't already, a confrontation with the signifier that would put an end to the expansion of the trauma. So I think civilization is without a signifier. So there's neither multipolarity nor unipolarity. Instead, what we witness with Russia is bipolarity. Russia's bipolar. It's a bipolar civilization state. Bipolar. So when Alexander Dugin, for example, wrote to India, to the Indians, as he did not so long ago, an appeal to the people of India to discuss their mutual project against the unipolar world, that they ought to be in solidarity with the multipolar worldview and share in the status of being a civilization state, he attempted to convince the Indians that they were not to have their own truth, which to me seems a bit of a contradiction. So for him, it's not that there's an American truth, a Russian truth, and an Indian truth. See you, Mark. I don't think so. For Dugin, India must join what he calls the Eurasian project, which is spearheaded by Russia. It's a truth that stands up to the American truth, the tyrants. So for him, that makes it two truths. It's not multipolarity. I'm going to quote Dugin. This is in his letter to the Indian public. A multipolar order is inconceivable without India as a fully independent pole. More than that, a multipolar order can be established and made irreversible only with India. The very fact of India joining Eurasia and reaffirming herself as a civilization state can convince the West that the game of hegemony is over and enhance the possibilities of a peaceful transition. End quote. You see, I think there's something really important here because he's talking about multipolarity. He says they would be an independent pole, but this position is immediately overridden by Dugin when he insists that India joined the Eurasian pole. You're a civilization state like us. So he misses a point. Civilization's not multiple. It's a whole without a signifier. So his claim that there's only two truths, it's a bipolar position. So I also have some issues with the way he uses the concept of truth here. Dugin. Are there really only two possible truths? Is there a truth saying that's not reducible to the fictions of the unconscious? If we claim that truth has the structure of a fiction, then it's because it confronts jouissance as such. It led Jacques-Alain Miller to claim, I quote him, if one cannot say the whole truth, then this is because there's a register of existence where truth does not apply. And this register is jouissance, that which gives satisfaction, end quote. So it's a defense against the vulnerability of truth when one positions oneself in the field of non-dupery. And in such a case, we can say the truth itself speaks. Maybe. Lacan said that on television, right? He said, I always speak the truth. What never lies is jouissance. So maybe I think I'm making a really stupid distinction. There's truth of the unconscious, and then there's the truth itself speaking, jouissance, truth of the par l'être, something like that. It even led, it reminds me of a passage from Slavoj Zizek, which I'm going to quote. Woman cannot relate to truth as an inherent value. She cannot tell the truth. However, truth can speak in or through her. The reversal from I speak the truth to I the truth speak, which I think was taken from the middle period of Lacan, occurs with a woman's identification with the truth. Men tell the truth, while in woman, truth itself speaks. end quote. Okay. It's a dense passage. Maybe we can pick it apart later, but I would just say that maybe there's something in Dugin's statement about the two truths that's homologous to what we might presume we know about the Creonic and Antigonian truths. On the one hand, there's the erosion of a truth which functions within the coordinates of an ineffective repressive law. On the other hand, there's a truth which speaks without recourse to the law. So I don't think we should presume that these are two mutually exclusive truths, truth positions. It's precisely because jouissance can only speak the truth that Creon staged his defense. Like the Creonic truth has within itself, and it's exposed during its erosion, the Antigonian truth that it denies, jouissance as such. So Creon, when he's confronted with Antigone, he says, the truth is hard to bear. So it seems to me that civilization has now become a term with which there can be, how would I say it? I wouldn't say that there is discontent within civilization, but rather that civilization itself has become our discontent. We used to feel ourselves estranged within civilization to such an extent that we might have claimed with Marx and so on, that there was an estrangement within the social order. However, today, civilization itself has become estranged. The nation state intended to impose the law upon civilization in order to produce the civilized, always producing outlaws in the process. But today, the nation state is in a state of collapse, and maybe the correct approach is to yell, like Rosa Luxemburg, socialism or barbarism or whatever. She didn't say civilization or barbarism, but why not? It was the modern civilization with its nation states that gave rise, I think, to Freud's invention of psychoanalysis. It was the benefit from the illness of civilization of his time. But today's civilization is the source of our discontent. And I really like how Slavoj put this in his the first documentary on Zizek in the English-speaking world. I'm quoting it. Civilization and its discontents means that civilization as such is pathological. We are out of touch in civilization as such, so there is no normal civilization, end quote. I take it to mean that we're all disconnected from civilization, from the unconscious of our time. We can only speak from we seem to only be capable of speaking from the multiple solutions to jouissance, to modes of jouissance, and so on. It's why I want to put an end to the multiplicity of all of these discussions concerning the movement from the mode of production to the modes of jouissance and so on. And to put an end to it, I wanted to quote something that Lacan said in his The Third, quote, "Nevertheless, all our experience is based on the discontent that Freud somewhere refers to as the discontents of civilization," end quote. And I'll give you a sense as to why I like this passage by quoting Jacques-Alain Miller, quote, "Now is the time of civilization and its discontents, and even a little beyond, the time of civilization and its horror," end quote. I think we're living the horror today. So how to escape the horror? My choice, maybe it's a choice against my brothers, is to turn toward the psychoanalytic school, which is, for me, a space of refuge from civilization. the word civilization, or sorry, the word refuge, refugee, refuse, waste. It's an important word for those who are displaced by war, like Polynices, in a sense, Creon and Antigone. I defend the concept of the school as best as I can, which doesn't mean I do it very well, but like a lonely militant. Lacan said, quote, "This term school is to be taken in the sense it had in ancient times. It meant some places of refuge or bases of operation against what could already be called civilization and its discontents," end quote. So obviously the school doesn't have a memorial plaque for Polynices or anything like that, but it's a place of refuge during the horror of civilization. And there's even an antinomy, Miller pointed this out, an antinomy, psychoanalysis and civilization, or psychoanalysis and capitalism, which is exactly what Miller said in his apparently anti-capitalist presentation, which you can find in the newsletter of the Freudian Field, volume 4, numbers 1 and 2, 1990. It's called A Reading of Some Details in Television in Dialogue with the Audience. I think it was at Bernard College, not Bard College. That would make it very threatening to Russians. In that text, Miller echoed Lacan in claiming that the psychoanalyst discourse is the only counterpoint to the discourse of mastery, but he added that it was a counterpoint to what I'm calling the flooding of civilization. And in his psychoanalytic manifesto, which isn't exactly the sort of political manifesto you might expect it to be, he claimed that, quote, "psychoanalysis shall never surrender to civilization," end quote. It's a militant statement in its way, I think. It doesn't make me defend NATO, as maybe some of our brothers are now doing, or to defend the American unipolarity, but I won't surrender. And it's a refusal to surrender to civilization, but it doesn't mean that you denounce capitalism or that I'll denounce capitalism, as in the case of a political anti-capitalism. Lacan cautioned against that. He said, "Denouncing the capitalist discourse only improves it," end quote. Actually, I'll quote him in full. "In relating this misery of the discourse of the capitalist, I denounce the latter. Only here I point out in all seriousness that I cannot do this, because in denouncing it, I reinforce it by normalizing it, that is, improving it," end quote. Okay, so I think that's basically where we're at. I feel like we're really in a flood today. It's the flooding, the phoneg that comes from the reign of the signified. The reign of the signified. So I wouldn't say I want to burn books. I know I was talking a lot about books in the last lecture. I wouldn't say I want to burn books. They're too wet, they wouldn't burn anyway. But maybe it's something about defending the signifier without the signified, which sounds paradoxical, I know, but maybe the best way to put it is to quote Miller. "What we call the unconscious is a signifier that is waiting for a signified." I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
All right, Duane, thank you so much. I'm happy to facilitate a conversation and just remind people that they have the freedom to jump in as they wish. I wanted to ask Duane a more practical question, which is, can you explain your interest in the Antigone? Why Antigone? There are a lot of myths. Why not Hamlet? Why not, like we talked about the last time, the hostage? by Paul Claudel, which is a more modern version. What, for you, draws you back to Antigone? What about this? Again, I think it's the most widely read seminar of Lacan, and I think for Lacanians that have been reading Lacan for a while, we tend to say, hey, oh, the ethics seminar is like, that's the beginner's stuff. But of course, our friend Hugh can remind us that perhaps there is a reason that it is the most widely read seminar. And I was drawn to something that Nina Power said once on social media a few years ago, which was that she asked a sociological question pertaining to why Antigone comes in and out of being popular within left-wing continental philosophy academia. And she put forward a thesis that it relates to capitalist crisis. So perhaps the fact that the recession is already here and we have that strange refusal of the temporality of acceptance, perhaps would be the way to describe our relationship to the crises, plural. Perhaps there is something there that beckons Antigone to us. Perhaps also it is the context of warfare that beckons us to Antigone as well. Those are some thoughts. But what is the meaning and the significance of Antigone for you?
Really good question, because it's a really good question because I don't know. Antigone's been coming up a lot in discussions lately. I was talking a lot about melancholia before, and for some reason that led me to Antigone. I think that there's an idea going around that Antigone is some sort of a revolutionary figure. I mean, it's just kind of circulating out there, this idea. When I think there's, and I'm not suggesting that that it's implied in Lacan's text or Zizek's or anywhere else, but there's a sense in which the stubbornness and perhaps cruelty of Antigone, I risk saying, I'm not entirely sold on it, is being overlooked. And I think, other than that, I'm not entirely sure why.
Yeah,
You're
that's
right to
helpful.
point at the war.
That's
You're right.
helpful. Yeah,
You're right to point at the war, though, Daniel. I think that's a part of it too,
yeah.
because all of this, of course, is occurring in the context of war.
Mm-hmm.
And but I'm sure there could be many other things we can talk about, like other plays and so on, where war is a theme. But maybe there's something about Antigone that none of us know how to deal with, and so that's why we can't stop talking about it.
I really liked True Detective season 2, which had the character named Antigone, and do you remember her? Does anybody have seen True Detective? It's so good. I forget the name of the actress, but she was, and it was an allegorical contemporary setting in Los Angeles, and she was a police officer, but her father, the Oedipal figure, was a post-Oedipal figure in the sense that he was a New Age guru who was very much like horizontal family, like a post-prohibitory family, hippie family, and then of course his daughter produced the 180 of that. And it was interesting that her name was Antigone because it was a representation, a symbolization of a new form of protest against the horizontal postmodern, counterculture, familial setup, right? Not to say that she falls sway to some reactionary, pro-patriarchal position, but it was kind of a nice little touch in the film, and I really liked I liked her affect quite a lot, also because it showed that there was something about a kind of post. And Judith Butler, in her work on Antigone, also, when she wrote on Antigone, she also wrote about a motif which horrifies me personally, which is the motif of post-liberation. The idea that our society is post-liberation. That, in other words, it's almost a kind of, I don't know, a materialist claim on the tradition of liberation politics as such. That we're at a deadlock, and then we have a kind of, I don't know, paradoxes and conundrums apropos liberation. So I think that Antigone, maybe we could say, is brought about at these moments of impossibility and tragic impasses. So that's my comment. I will stop and invite others.
Can you hear me?
Andrew, yeah.
Yeah. Hey, this is Andrew. Hey, Duane, thank you for this very provocative and interesting discussion. I guess I'm going to throw out a little bit, I hope that's okay, some questions where I feel like that there's a little bit, if I may put it like this, kind of, I know that it seems to be part of the criteria here that I think you even say later, but I guess I'm a little anxious as to why this overdetermined, is the way I would read it, I'm sorry, effort to avoid a Marxist analysis by any means possible almost. And so I'll just elaborate on your very, well put out list that you at one point discussed the current era named, known with signifiers like rogue states, evil empire, axis of evil. I think we'd have to include in there shitholes, as Trump put it. We'd have to also include the way in which he spoke, I don't know if people remember, super idealistically about the building of the wall, that he was at one point, he didn't play up on this very long, but he described it as something like a Disneyland, a kind of Donald Trump hotel, that at the top of it would be like restaurants and wonderful times for people to enjoy themselves. So I'm going back to what you're saying here in terms of the focus and centrality of enjoyment. But I want to kind of correlate that into mature, advanced neoliberalism, so that we have a figure like, and Badiou wrote about or lectured a little bit about this years ago, that we may be, and it's very hard to say, this is kind of Hegelian of him, that we may be in a different era, that Trump represented a fight with the oligarchs, that is to say, including the elitist world of the Clintonites and various types like these folks within the higher level of capitalism in the West, Macron, et cetera, all interconnected in a network, not to sound like a paranoid conspiracy theory person here, but to say that what we're looking at is a shift in the balance that is now after NAFTA and various effects of it, the Iraq War, the effort of the neocons to shock and awe, and then that they did so well in making tons of money off of murdering 200,000 people in Iraq. So we're in an era now where, which at the time, if you remember the protests then, were like, no war for oil, et cetera. There were various battlegrounds by the left to pop a hole through the signifier. Now, I think, I just want to reference for a moment, maybe I'm just speaking out of turn, so to speak, but Antigone, where Zizek may be a little off and a little bit old-fashioned the way he's approaching it, but I think we could think about that it represents now, perhaps, from a left point of view, I guess, would be a traditional left point of view, a figure like Rittenhouse, or who I like to call Rottenhouse, but Rittenhouse, who is willing, with full of enjoyment and the tickle of fire of jouissance, to get out in the streets and with his guns and beat back in defense of a regular little used car salesman, an ordinary petty bourgeois guy who's being offended and threatened by the movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's his job to take on power himself, represent a higher level of law, and has every right to defend that. Very similar to Antigone's claim, I think, if we read her a little bit through a Foucaultian read of literature, that she is in a older fashioned code of moral code. I mean, the other scholars have written of this, that Antigone speaks from a position that Creon is more like this modern guy, sort of like, how can I put it, like a Obama or a Clintonite. You know, it's like after the Reagan years, then you had this kind of smooth, or Tony Blair, smooth neoliberalism. And in a way, the Antigone is kind of representing a little bit like from this argument, a Proud Boys kind of, I'm going to break through Jan 6. And I don't know if you've seen any clips, they're being shared on Facebook right now, where literally they have clips interviewing Proud Boys guys who are complaining that they were arrested after breaking into on Jan 6 in Capitol. And they're complaining that it's an astonishing thing to be called to task for breaking the law. And I think what I'm trying to drive at here is that there is an issue that you're raising that's very interesting about the question, I think, of the order, or the enjoyment of the order of civilization. Let's put it like that to some extent, that there is a kind of major anxiety as to, you know, where you have this kind of hatred of the Clintonites by many working people, not necessarily Trumpian supporters, and certainly Proud Boys characters right now, literally speaking to that very era of neoliberalism that the quote libtards gave us this society and told us just to, you know, get more schooling, or you're screwed. You're going to have to live in a modern day shithole, as Trump puts it. So I guess what this all comes to is, I'm just wondering why, in a way, it's interesting to so much centralize the issue of affirmative singular jouissance. But if we're leaving aside these kind of persistent signifiers, I'll put it like that, material signifiers, structural things such as the development of neoliberalism and where we're at now today, do we then, in how we're talking about Russia here, it somehow starts to get into this ethno-national character when, and I don't mean to be super reductive of all that in an old-fashioned Marxist way, but I really have a doubt that we would see Putin being able to even do this if he didn't have oil and minerals and nuclear weaponry to be able to engage in this action. Those are material, rather boring Kantian real things, but it is what it is. And it is a part of the class, you know, dynamic at a larger level. Anyway, that's all my commentary. I hope it's not too broad, sweeping all over the place, but I just wanted to raise up some of these questions.
Andrew, that's fascinating. Thanks for reminding me about his expression, the shithole countries. But you know, it's important to have a place to put your shit. You raise a really interesting point about the material realities of Russian civilization, how it has oil and nukes, and as you go on, I start to think, well, couldn't we say Russia has everything it needs? It doesn't need anything, you know? What's there left for desire when you have everything you need? And so it's a point. And that's basically all. I mean, that's basically all I had to say about what you were saying. But
can I ask a question about Andrew's comment? It seems like a right-left reversal in a certain sense, in the way in which the Antigone-esque desire is nowhere to be found on the left. I'm getting that feeling. Or if it is found on the left, maybe the feeling is that we exert a suspiciousness of that, in the sense that the Antigone desire is a successful one because it's capable of penetrating something beyond the law of the state, whereas the left today seems mired in the what that you would call the state of this, the state, right? Even in its revolt. That's one of my provocative theories that I develop in my book by reading like people like Rene Girard. You could call that a pessimistic theory, but I think it should be a humbling theory for the left. So if the right is more Antigone-like, it doesn't necessarily mean that Antigone needs to be called a totalitarian, but I don't know what it means. And I wonder, Andrew or Duane or others, what that might mean.
I just want to make one point. I think, you know, one of the things I maybe I'm wrong in my reading of Antigone, but it seems to me that Antigone has everything she needs, and she's pretty keen on reminding us that she doesn't need anything. And so I think that's a very dangerous position to be in. And I think that reminds me a little bit about Russia. But when we look in the West, I don't think we can necessarily say that vis-a-vis Russia. We don't have everything we need over here. We're, you know, running out of oil. You know, we have an inflation. I mean, the Russians stabilized their currency pretty quickly. So, you know, that's the only point I wanted to make about what you're saying, Daniel. As for this left and right thing, I'm not really personally invested in upholding that distinction so much. I see Hugh with the microphone. Yeah.
Hi, Duane and everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Thanks again for a really interesting talk. I don't want to ramble at length as I did last week, but just a few simple maybe points, maybe leading up to a question. I really like your invocation of the Lacanian school, you know, as a refuge, Lacan invoking the ancient meaning of the school, which he describes as a refuge against what was already our discontent in civilization, you know. Just an off the cuff preliminary question. Do you think the school in that sense could be a model for a new social bond, you know? That would be my, if not hope, my maybe wager stroke hope, you know, that kind of possibility. And maybe related to that is the extraordinary statement by you quoted from Miller. Maybe I haven't reproduced it accurately, but something like psychoanalysis will never surrender to civilization. Yeah. If I've got that right, yeah, what an extraordinary statement, you know. Again, maybe invoking the notion of the school as a refuge and psychoanalysis as a refuge, you know, against the discontents of civilization. But I wonder, and another question perhaps, I wonder, is that, would you see that as an antinomian position, maybe akin to Antigone, or something else, you know? I see it as it's a kind of claim for psychoanalysis in that it provides some kind of space or room for maneuver within the prison house of civilization, you know. And this, of course, is where the notion of jouissance comes in. Yeah. Miller, I mean, actually speaks of a kind of democracy of jouissance, to each his her jouissance, you know, which is itself a kind of refuge, yeah, against this prison house of civilization, you know. Um, Daniel mentioned the ethics seminar, widely read, but sometimes dismissed as kind of beginner Lacan, you know, and so on. And we've moved on from that and so on, you know. But yeah, I mean, I think the ethics seminar is really important. Also, because in a way it exemplifies the meaning of the school for me, you know, as a kind of refuge. And maybe I'll just to conclude with this, my just thinking about it, my reading of the Miller statement, psychoanalysis will never surrender to civilization. I wonder, would you agree with this, or what anybody else thinks of this reading of that statement, that psychoanalysis as an ethics, okay? Seminar 7 is called The Ethics of Psychoanalysis, not the politics of psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis as an ethics will never surrender to the total politicization of civilization, or civilization as a strictly political entity. Okay. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Hugh. As always, amazing comments. Psychoanalysis, the psychoanalytic school as a model for the social bond. I don't know. I don't know. I can't say for sure. I know for me, it gives me something of a space. You know, it's interesting for me. It was when the war happened, you know it already, but when the war happened for me, losing the classroom, the university, everything, all. It was the school and the cartel that kind of gave me something to lean on for all these months, without which I would have been leaning on my brothers for sure. And which isn't to say I haven't been leaning on them. I have too, but it served a very important function for me, and it still does. So I can't say that it would be a model for all of the social bond, but it is for me, and it's important for me right now. But it does. There is something here that I want to explore a bit more in my own way in the future, which is the relationship of what goes on inside the school in terms of the sort of speech that's happening in there and discussions and written work, and its relationship to what's outside of the school. We know that there's lots of people who are not members of the school, not members of the societies, and so on, who are not practicing analysts and so on, that get involved in cartel work and various things. But to be honest, despite the efforts, I don't see much of an engagement outside of the cartels in the school. There is some, and I can see it a little bit here and there, like just to take one example, the Lacanian reviews online as an example. You can read some texts that are kind of fun, and other people can write there, and it's sort of like, you know, it's outside the school kind of it. But I, you know, it's something I've noticed, and maybe it's just I'm not seeing it. I don't see a lot of people who are members in the more bureaucratic sense giving public talks and so on, that are populated, you know, by a lot of people who are in a different sort of, just in a naive sense, world or whatever. And I find that kind of interesting, and but I have to develop a way of thinking about it. What you said about will not surrender to civilization, and you take it as an ethical refusal to surrender to what, a politic or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I was reading civilization as this in this different register, and you know, I'm just experimenting, I guess, but this register of this excess civilization as a too muchness, as opposed to, say, a nation state which is properly bounded in, or tries to be, and so on. And so when I read will not surrender to civilization, I was taking it more in that sense of like will not surrender to I don't know what. Okay, we had some other questions. Yeah, thanks, Hugh.
Can I ask? Yeah. So yeah, one thing, sorry, not obviously, but I was thinking about is that psychoanalysis surely had already surrendered to civilization, or always has been surrendered to civilization in that, in any sense at least. At least, you know, individuals or areas of psychoanalysis have, you know, schools, individual schools. And then, you know, the question is, well, what is the individual? Does the individual represent good psychoanalysis if it isn't psychoanalysis as a whole? And, you know, it begs the question of whether psychoanalysis actually exists in the sense that people might think it does. But my original point that I wanted to make was about the, because I came into Lacan in this seminar was recommended to me by a friend, through gender theory, through transgender theory, you know, and that kind of school. So I read essays on the feminine sexuality first. I've never read to the extent that it should be the ethics. But certainly within this sense, when I find that, of course, it needs to be explored to a much larger extent. Just referencing Gayatri Spivak in almost every reference that Lacanians or, you know, so on and so forth, you know, make to femininity as this thing and not the other, and especially coming through a transgender studies lens, one could posit the idea that feminine was a mistake. The word feminine, to use the idea of femininity, was a mistake in the first place. But it's just the word; it's not the concept. Purely from a standpoint of, well, again, it needs to be fleshed out a little bit more, but from a standpoint of coming from transgender analysis into Lacanian analysis, and they're not incompatible, but when you come from that school to Lacanian school and vice versa, the use of the feminine, you know, the idea of the feminine in a sense makes it incompatible for transgender studies. So it needs to be changed to then be inserted, Lacanian theory to be inserted into that. And that's where I'm going to leave it.
That's a wonderful comment. Thank you, Dorian. It's a really, you know, and it's something I've heard before, you know, why this necessity or this insistence on continuing to use the word the woman or feminine jouissance, and so on in psychoanalysis. And to be perfectly honest, I don't know. And I even wonder at times, and as you're speaking, I find myself very empathetic to what you're saying, because it's like, why didn't we go the way of like the mathematicians, you know? and come up with these technical concepts or whatever, like, I don't know, par lettre or something. Why didn't we? Why didn't we? And I wonder if it was because, you're right, psychoanalysis emerged within the context of the discontents of civilization, which means within a field of language which was offered to it through patients, maybe. And I'm not trying to defend psychoanalysis. Maybe I'm wrong about this. And so these were the signifiers that were brought to them. Or maybe it was the signifiers that they imposed upon the clinic or whatever. But if you insist upon the clinic as the space from which inventions and discoveries are made possible, then what we really need are more trans people in the clinic. Because with more trans people in the clinic, we would have a language suited to the times. If that's true, if it's true that we derive our signifiers from civilization or whatever, then it implies we need more people who are using signifiers differently, or whatever however you want to put it, in the clinic. Unfortunately, it's tough because maybe we don't have quite so many in the clinic. So I hear your point, and I hope I do. I really recognize what it is that you're trying to point at, and I think you're onto something. Did I hear somebody wanted to say something a moment ago? I heard a microphone. Was it Hugh? No? Okay. No. Though I will say though that when I attend some clinical case studies, you hear often different sorts of presentations where you don't hear things like feminine jouissance or the woman and so on. But I think you're right, and I wonder if it points at well, we all know there's a conflict today. People are discussing the conflict between theory and the clinic, and there are people who try and resolve it and say, well, they're in some sort of a relationship with one another and so on. I don't think that's what the fundamental tension is in the end, not between theory and the clinic, but ultimately between knowledge or meaning and experience in some sense, or something like that. And so I think, yeah. Anybody else? I'm feeling quite exhausted, folks. I apologize.
I think Luis, I'll just read this comment from Luis very quickly, and we can let Duane go, because it is much later in Europe than it is in the States. So Luis, I'll just read it out loud. Should we think of Antigone's stubbornness as the return of the repressed from the tyrannic law of Creon, who broke the harmony between the human and divine law? Antigone could have been anyone else in the state. I guess she was not the only one dissatisfied with Creon's ruling. In that way, in the context of Russia, Antigone should be the repressed of Russian society. Yeah. Nice. Do you agree with that, Duane?
I see where it's going. It's just that I worry when I talk about presuppositions about the other, and how we presume that the other is some neurotic like ourselves or something like that. I worry that we might do that when we look into the eyes of Russia and see what it is, whatever it is that we expect to see. I'm not entirely convinced by it. But I see the argument, and I'm open to being persuaded. I think it's much worse than that. I don't see repression as a key word of Russian civilization. Look, I'll give you an example, okay? Because I'm sorry, I'm talking a little. I'm getting some really loud background noise, so it's a bit hard to. Apologies. Maybe you can. Yeah, we got it. Thank you, Daniel. Sorry about that. No, look. what's repression? Let's talk about repression, let's say in the Western setting. Repression in the Western setting. Okay, you go out and you protest. I'm doing it really, this is a really naive depiction of repression. Political repression, I'm saying, not. Okay, political repression. You go out, you protest, and then they go and they arrest you, whatever. Okay. What happens in Russia? Can we call it repression? You don't even get to go out and stand to get repressed. It's foreclosed. Like, before you even begin to protest, the FSB or the police or whatever, they are already there locking you up. You know, I think that's quite different than political repression or repression in the neurotic sense. That's foreclosure, as far as I can see. Like the political protest of, let's say, somebody like Antigone, it's blocked before it gets off the ground. And that's why I get a little concerned when we start looking at people like, I don't know, Pussy Riot as some exemplary, and I'm not saying they're not, as some exemplary political revolutionary figures in Russia. No, they just happen to make it past for a couple minutes, foreclosure, to actually stage a bit of a protest so we can see it for a moment in Western media. And we think, oh, that's not the problem. If we think the problem is that they protested and then they were arrested, okay, that's a problem, yeah. But I think shit, like, it's much worse than that. I think in Russia, it's to the point where your protest cannot even get off the ground in the first place. Like, to even begin, we used to call that civil society. The idea of civil society as a defense in the war of position, as Gramsci used to say, you know, we still, in some sense, have a little bit of a space of civil society in the West, a little bit. You know, we see it right here, for example. But in Russia, these spaces of counter-hegemony, civil society, where political dissent even has the chance of being rejected in the first place, it's already gone. They've been defunded, and so I'm empathetic to this position that, like, maybe there's a repressed civil society in Russia, or striving to rise up. But I think in this sense, I'm much more pessimistic. It's really dark. It's really dark. I think it's much, much worse than that. And so that's why I point at Russia being Antigone, rather than Russia as a Creon or whatever repressing Antigone. And I mean,
That's
also look at
fascinating.
Putin. I mean, look at Putin. In some sense, you could say, is he really this totalitarian, like, fascist sort? I'm not sure, because in some sense he's so beholden to all the oligarchs and so on, and the West knows that. You know, he's got little secret deals with oligarchs here and there, and this sort of stuff. I just think it's a bit of a much darker position. Yeah, thank you so much, Louis.
Wow, that's very fascinating. Yeah, I think Alain Badiou says that Antigone represents the affect of anxiety, and it represents the affect of anxiety because her courage performs what he calls a scission on the law of the superego, which is embodied by Creon. And if we take the thesis that I work with, which is that late capitalism is superego deprived, or kind of a crisis of acephalic superego, you could see why that formula of an anxious Antigone exposing the superego, exposing the repressive superego, simply no longer works. So you have to have a revamped Antigone, right? And maybe anxiety is not the affect of Antigone. That would be another question I would want to ask. What is the affect of Antigone? Because I like Badiou in the sense that he splits the Aeschylean and the Sophoclean formulas structured around characters that embody affects. They embody primary affects. So is Antigone's affect still anxiety? What is anxiety to the law today? Would be another question that raises for me. And I know that's a big question, but and Duane, shall we close? Are you
That's a wonderful point to close on. Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, sorry about that. Beautiful sessions. Let's do it again. Thank you all very much. We'll post the video for anybody that missed it. And in fact, we'll be back tomorrow if anyone wishes to join us for a wonderful conversation at 9:30 a.m. on Georg Lukács and Mark Fisher and class consciousness. Shoot me an email if you're interested. Duane, thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everybody.